After Rome's regal period, that of the kingdom, they entered into what was known as the Roman Republic. The word republic comes from the Latin words res publica, which literally translates to the public thing. The republic was, therefore, by definition, a system that belonged to the people, to the public. In this lecture, we're going to explore what a republic is, what it meant to the Romans, its strengths and weaknesses, and some of the important institutions and social structures that constituted the Roman Republic. While our chief concern will be the offices of government and military, we will also pay special attention to the ways in which the Romans categorized and classified their people. And I must caution you now, because we are dealing with Roman terms, many of the key words you encounter in this lecture will be Latin. There is, unfortunately, no way around this. Nevertheless, I will try to keep these terms to a minimum. Before we begin, I should make one final note. When I begin speaking about Roman officials, it is important to remember that the number of officials and the jobs they performed varied by time and place. When necessary, I'll mention major shifts in these areas, but for the most part, I'm speaking very generally about the functions of these officials and the jobs they performed. Patricians and plebeians. The chief way in which the Romans divided themselves was by birth. There were two types of Roman citizens, patricians and plebeians. These are worth memorizing. I'm going to repeat it one more time, patricians and plebeians. What are they? Well, patricians were those of noble birth. Plebeians were everyone else. To be a patrician, you had to be born a patrician. You were born a patrician if both parents were patricians. The term patrician comes from the Latin word for father, pater. According to Roman sources, chiefly Livy, this is the origin of the term patrician because the first 100 citizens of Rome were known as fathers, and their heirs became known as patricians, or those who could indicate that they had hailed from this noble class. You would expect patricians as nobles to be wealthier than plebeians. This, however, was not necessarily the case. You can have wealthy patricians naturally, but some plebeians had more wealth than patricians. Julius Caesar, who came from a patrician family known as Julia, the Julians, was very poor and heavily in debt during the earliest phases of his career. By Caesar's lifetime, the powers of the patricians had waned dramatically. In Rome's earliest history, the patrician class alone had access to public office and controlled the state without the aid of plebeians. Over time, however, the plebeians would earn their own offices. Furthermore, Rome constantly experienced social changes that we're going to deal with in future lectures. These social changes kept the relationships between the plebeians and the patricians in a constant state of flux. The only way a plebeian could become a patrician was through adoption. Adoption was a common Roman practice. One of the more famous cases of Roman adoption is Augustus, who was adopted by Julius Caesar. In addition to the people being divided between patrician and plebeian, the Romans also had different ways in which they handled men and women. Rome was a male-dominated society, meaning men had higher places in society than women. Despite this, women enjoyed a bit more flexibility in Rome than they would have in other areas of the Mediterranean, specifically ancient Greece. This is true with regard to public interactions specifically. Women in ancient Rome could go out in public with little or no stigma. This was not the case in ancient Greece. Despite this bit of freedom, however, women still could not enter into the military, they couldn't vote, and they couldn't enter into legal contracts, so there are a few rare exceptions of this. Now, although Rome was male-dominated, men were held to certain standards. Men were expected to possess certain qualities. The first was they needed to possess virtus, V-I-R-T-U-S. Virtus. This word virtus is where we get the word virtue. In Latin, virtus comes from the word vir, man, V-I-R. Virtus is best translated as, therefore, manliness or bravery. It was an attribute only men could possess. But it is worth noting that after the arrival of Christianity, the Latin-speaking world would start to apply this masculine term to women, especially those who became martyrs for their faith. During the first millennium BCE, however, this was strictly a quality only men could achieve. Virtus was earned most often by demonstrating one's ability on the battlefield. A person who had virtus would be the first one to charge into combat and the last one to flee. Another quality a man had to possess was gravitas. This word exists in English and means the same thing. Gravitas was one's ability to be serious in the face of serious situations. Additionally, a man had to have pietas, or piety. And finally, a man had to have dignitas. This is often translated as dignity. He had to live with honor and not besmirch his family name. Possession of all these virtues gave a Roman male auctoritas, or authority. And to have authority, you had to have all these things, all these characteristics. People in Rome were also divided by citizenship. There were citizens, non-citizens, and slaves in ancient Rome. Now, as I made clear in a previous lecture, slavery was not based on skin color. Slaves were born into slavery or enslaved by being conquered or sold into it to settle some sort of debt. Slaves had no rights. I'm going to deal with citizens and non-citizens in a later lecture, and I don't want to repeat myself, so let's just leave it at that for now. There were citizens, non-citizens, and slaves. Citizens of Rome were further organized into tribes and centuries. The way in which Romans organized by tribe and century varied considerably over time. Rather than present a convoluted discussion about these changes, I want to simply emphasize a single aspect of tribes and centuries. Tribes and centuries were the chief way by which the Romans gathered and organized in public life, and as they gathered and organized when they prepared for war. A person's place in a tribe was determined by kin. But a person's place within a given century, determined by a census, was based on their wealth and status in society. The person who determined a person's century was a Roman official known as a censor, who we're going to meet in just a few minutes. When Rome readied for war, this was the chief way by which the Roman citizens. So, when you think about tribes and centuries, think of military and social political classifications of Roman citizens. Male citizens participated in the military and, if they wished, public office. Those who wished to enter public office often needed two things: money and popular support. These are still the two chief needs of any politician. Money could be obtained by independent wealth or by taking out loans. Julius Caesar is famous for having acquired high debts in order to run for office. Why? Well, because it was an investment. Public service was not only a path for honor and power, but it was also a way to obtain immense wealth. Investing in political campaigns was a financial investment that could pay large dividends in return. The second component was popular support. Just as today, politicians cannot win if people don't like them. The way Romans garnered popular support was by displaying all the virtues mentioned earlier: pietas, gravitas, dignitas, virtus, etc. They demonstrated these virtues on the battlefield and in the public spaces. If a person ran from battle or never fought well, he could expect to never obtain public office. The people would neither like nor respect him. Further, they wouldn't trust him. The other element of popular support occurred in public spaces. Politicians in Rome, just like today, had to speak to the people. This was how they garnered support. Speaking in ancient Rome, however, was a hostile enterprise. Political speeches bashed opponents mercilessly. To be a good public speaker, therefore, you had to not only have physical capacity to speak to large numbers with a booming voice, you also had to have the dignitas, to take insults and not show weakness through tears or anger. The custom by which men progressed through public office was known as the cursus honorum, which literally means the course of honors. Cursus honorum. This consisted of several offices. To reach the highest offices, that of consul and censor, one had to first progress through lower offices. To run for office, it was expected that you had already served 18 to 20 years in the military. Roman men typically entered the military around the age of 16 or 18. This means that the first time someone ran for office, they were already into their mid to late 30s. For the remainder of this lecture, we're going to be speaking about these offices and what each office was responsible for. The first office you should know is that of quaestor. Romans who wanted to enter public life would often start by running for quaestor. During the Republic, quaestors were responsible for maintaining Roman funds. This was considered a way to test the politician's resolve. If he could be trusted with money, then perhaps he could be trusted with greater responsibilities as well. Initially, there were 4 quaestors, but in the 3rd century, Rome underwent some political and social reforms, and this number increased to 10. This number would again eventually increase in the 1st century under the reforms of the Roman dictator Sulla. We're going to speak about him specifically in these changes in future lectures. Quaestors were almost always patricians. For now, associate quaestor simply with the treasury and the maintaining of public funds. Some Roman politicians would run for praetor after they served as quaestor. Many who wished to advance to consul would often run for aedile as well, after they served as quaestor. There were 2 aediles. The first aedile was the aedile of the plebs. This office was exclusively held by plebeians, and it was intended to secure the rights of the plebs and to make sure that the patricians did not take advantage of their class. The second aedile was the curule aedile, which could be held by both patrician and plebeians, but only in alternating years. This was meant to secure a balance of power between the 2 classes. This office was responsible for putting on public events, festivals, and maintaining public works. Now, the reason many politicians ran for aedile was because it showed the people that they were more than just power-hungry politicians. It showed the people that they were able to put on public works and public needs for the good of the people before their own ambition. Now, it also was a way to garner popular support. Believe it or not, putting on free festivals will actually make the people happy, and they will in turn be willing to vote for you in the future. So another office was tribune. I'm going to hold off on discussing tribune for a few lectures because it's going to come up again, and I want to spend time discussing about it specifically when it comes up in later lectures. The next office I want to talk about, though, is praetor. One of the highest offices in Rome was that of praetor. In the 4th century, there was only 1 praetor elected once per year. In 242, the Romans increased this number to 2. In public life, praetors were responsible for hearing judgments and cases. They played the role of leader when the head official, the consul, was out of the city. In addition to this, the praetor possessed a thing called imperium, which was the ability to command. This is actually where we get the word emperor from, that word imperium. As such, the praetor could also lead an army if the general or consul was not available or if he had died. Next, we have the consul. The position of consul became official in 366. Prior to this, the consuls were simply tribunes with consular powers. After 366, Romans elected 2 consuls. They held office for 1 year. Their job and function was to be the generals of the military. When they were in the city, they also held several public functions as well. But they are chiefly known for their positions in the military, and they're most remembered for their military conquests or failures. And one thing I should make mention of while talking about the consul, this was the manner in which the Romans recorded their history. How do we mark time today? If you're in the Western world, we delineate our year by stating, quite falsely actually, how many years it has been since the birth of Jesus Christ. It is by no means universal. It is universal in the sense that we all follow the same number of days in the year, 365.25 days, but it is not universal in how we keep track of how many years have passed. The Romans lived in a time before Jesus was born. How did they record history then? They did it by writing down the names of the consuls who served that year. And when you look at Roman records, you don't find years, but rather the names of consuls. One of the highest offices was that of censor. 2 censors were elected every 5 years and held office for roughly 18 months. They were responsible for performing the census. After the 4th century, they also held the responsibility of choosing the Senate. In Rome, the censor unusually had no checks and balances. What do I mean by this? I mean that the censor had the ability to make decisions that would not be challenged by anyone else. In this regard, the censor was unique and powerful. The census that the censors initiated became a very important element of Roman society and state. It determined a person's place in society. When the citizens gathered for war, their place in society is what determined if they were placed in a specific century or tribe. In addition to this, the census determined who was in the cavalry or infantry. In other words, the census was not only the chief way in which Romans organized themselves publicly, it was the primary way that they organized the military. Remember, in the past few lectures we have described the Mediterranean as being a belligerent political arena, and the Italian peninsula particularly so. This is an example of that. The way in which the Romans organized themselves in public life was highly connected to the way in which they organized themselves for military campaigns. All of this was determined by the census, which is why the censors had such great power. Finally, we should say something about the types of public services women could enter into. There was really only one chief place for women in public service, and this was the Vestal Virgin. This is not a particularly unique role by the Romans. Many ancient Mediterranean civilizations used women to fulfill some kind of priestly duty. Oftentimes, these duties were connected to their virginity. Women who became Vestal Virgins were responsible for taking an oath of chastity. Those who broke their vows were buried alive. After 30 years of service, their oaths were completed and their duties to public services ceased. Their chief role was to maintain a fire for religious purposes. I also want to say something just before we conclude about the Senate. I am going to speak about the Senate in far greater detail in later lectures, when it becomes much more relevant. For now, I would like you to understand that the Roman Republic had a Senate, which acted as a check against other officials. The numbers in the Senate and the powers it held varied over time. Unlike the Senate in the United States, the Senate of the Roman Republic did not consist of elected officials. Instead, people entered the Senate at the appointment of public officials, initially the consul and later the censor. Once appointed, a senator served for life. Senators were often wealthy who had progressed all the way through the cursus honorum, and the Senate generally controlled the finances of the city and decided on key elements of foreign policy. The Senate also chose the places that consuls would go and take their Roman armies for the year. They also fulfilled many different administrative functions. Essentially, the Senate kind of kept the city of Rome running. So in conclusion, I know you've received a lot of terms throughout this lecture, and unfortunately, there is no way around that. I would like you to take some time to familiarize yourself with these terms and the functions of each office, as you're going to be hearing them in future lectures repeatedly.